I was 38 years old the week I learned exactly what my mother thought 14 years of showing up was worth. She said it with a smirk, standing in my own kitchen, holding a mug I'd bought her. We all agreed. You're not welcome at the wedding. I set down the pen I was holding. I remember that, the small click of it against the counter, and I said, good to know. I draft trust documents for a living. I spend my days translating what people actually mean into language that can survive a courtroom. So when my mother told me I'd been voted out of my own sister's wedding like a motion that failed to carry, some old professional part of my brain did what it always does. It started keeping minutes. Welcome back to Calm Revenge Tales, the channel where quiet people keep the receipts and family learns that boundaries have a price. If stories about dignity, documents, and consequences are your thing, drop a comment and subscribe, because this one has a number in it you are not going to forget. I should tell you who I was before that Tuesday, because it matters for what comes later. My name is Marin. I'm a trust and estate attorney, which means I spend most of my working life inside other people's endings, reading what they meant to leave behind, and untangling it from what their families decided to believe they'd left instead. It is quiet work. It rewards patience over passion. You learn, doing it long enough, that grief makes people creative liars, and that the truth usually just sits there in a file folder, waiting for someone calm enough to open it. 14 months before my mother stood in my kitchen with that smirk, my husband David died on a Tuesday in March, on a wet road 40 minutes from our house, in a crash that took 11 seconds and rearranged the rest of my life. We had been married 6 years. We were the kind of married where you develop a shorthand, where you good means an entire paragraph, where you can tell from the sound of someone's key in the door what kind of day they had. David was an engineer who loved spreadsheets the way other men love golf, and he loved my family with the specific, patient loyalty of a man who'd grown up with none of his own to speak of. He used to say my mother reminded him of weather. You didn't take it personally, you just planned around it. I was the one who showed up. That was my role in my family long before I had a law degree to make it official. I was the one who drove 3 hours on Christmas Eve because someone needed a ride. I was the one who paid the deposit when a wedding venue required it and nobody else had the card limit. I was the one who absorbed things, arguments, invoices, disappointments, the way a good foundation absorbs weight, silently, so the house upstairs never has to think about what's holding it up. There was an arithmetic to my family that nobody ever wrote down, but everybody ran. I gave. They received. Nobody kept score, because I was the only one who could have, and I never did. Until the week everything I'd given got weighed against everything I'd apparently never earned a seat. 6 years before that kitchen conversation, the spring before David and I got married, my parents were 41 days from losing their house. I found out by accident, the way you find out anything in a family built on managed silences. My mother mentioned, too casually, that the bank had sent some kind of letter and my father wasn't sleeping. I did what I do. I asked to see the letter. It was a notice of default. 41 days. David and I had been together 3 years by then. He didn't hesitate, and that was very like him. He decided things fast and then executed them slowly and correctly. He paid off the arrears and then the full remaining balance on my parents' mortgage, a little over $180,000. But David was, before he was anything else, a man who read the fine print on cereal boxes. He didn't hand my parents a check and a handshake. He had it done properly, a recorded promissory note, secured against the house, with my parents as the obligors and David as the note holder. Token payments, $25 a month, more ceremonial than actuarial. It was on paper alone. In every conversation my family ever had about it afterward, it was David helping out, said the way you'd describe someone picking up the check at brunch. I remember asking him, the night he told me what he'd done, why he'd bothered with the paperwork if he never intended to collect on it. He said something I wrote down later in the Notes app on my phone because it sounded like him distilled into one sentence. Because someday somebody's going to need to know this was real, Marin. Kindness that isn't written down is just a rumor. I didn't know, that spring, how right he'd turn out to be. For 6 years, That note sat quietly in a drawer in David's home office, renewed and re-recorded on schedule the way you'd change a smoke detector battery, dutiful and unremarkable. My family paid their $25 a month like a subscription they'd forgotten they were on. Nobody in my family ever asked to see the actual document. Nobody in my family, I would come to understand, had ever really believed there was a document at all. The Tuesday my mother told me about the wedding started like any other Tuesday, which is its own kind of cruelty in hindsight. My sister Chloe was getting married in the fall, an outdoor ceremony at our parents' house. The one with the wraparound porch and the maple tree David used to say looked like it was waving. I'd already sent the deposit for the tent rental because that was still my role even 14 months into being a widow. Grief hadn't changed the arithmetic, it had just made me tired of doing the math. My mother called to ask about linens. Then, in the same tone she'd used to mention the weather, she told me the guest list had been finalized. Finalized, I repeated. We all sat down and talked about it, she said. Your Aunt Carol thinks it'll be easier on everyone if you're not there. Given everything. Given how you've been since David. She said, since David, the way you'd reference a rainstorm that had inconvenienced a picnic. We all agreed, honestly. You're not welcome at the wedding. She smiled when she said it. I want to be precise about that, because precision is the only thing I have ever really trusted. She smiled the way you smile when you've won something you didn't think you'd have to fight for. I have a photograph of her in my head from that moment, arms crossed loosely, a genuine, untroubled ease in her face, because some part of me, the professional part, was already doing what it does. Cataloging. Timestamping. I remember thinking, with a strange, cold clarity, this is evidence of something, I just don't know what yet. Good to know, I said. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask why. I have learned, in 13 years of practicing law, that the question, why, is usually a request for someone to comfort you while they finish hurting you, and I wasn't interested in being comforted by the person doing the hurting. I hung up, and I did the only thing that has ever made sense to me in moments like that. I opened my laptop and I wrote down the date, the time, and what she'd said, word for word, while it was still fresh enough to be exact. Then I forwarded myself the text she'd sent an hour earlier with the finalized seating chart, a chart with my name conspicuously, deliberately absent, like a tooth pulled clean enough that the gap looks intentional. I sat with that screenshot a long time that night, not doing anything with it. Just looking at it, the way you look at an X-ray, waiting for it to explain the pain. 3 weeks later, David's estate attorney called and asked if I had time to come into the office. Not the kind of call you get for a signature. The kind of call where you can hear, in someone's voice, that they've been putting it off. His name was Elliot Frayne, a careful, silver-haired man who'd handled David's estate since the funeral, and who had the particular gentleness of someone who spends his career delivering news to people already underwater. I sat across from him in an office that smelled like old paper and printer toner, and he slid a folder across the desk, the way you'd slide something across a poker table you weren't sure you should be dealing. There's an asset in David's estate we hadn't fully accounted for, he said. It was recorded, but frankly, it got lost in the reappraisal after his passing. I want to walk you through it before anyone else finds out it exists. Inside the folder was the note. David's note. The $180,000, recorded and secured against my parents' house, with 6 years of amortization schedules attached, $25 payments logged in a column so tidy it might as well have had David's handwriting on it. A balance after 6 years of token payments and accruing interest at the modest rate David had set of $161,400. I want to tell you I felt something enormous in that moment. I didn't. Not the way you'd expect. What I felt was the specific, narrow click of a lock finding its key. I had spent 13 years reading documents that told the truth about people who'd stopped telling it about themselves. This was the first time the document was about me. As his sole heir, Elliot said, "The note is now yours. You're the holder. It's a real asset, Marin. Whatever anyone in your family has told themselves about it, legally, it's real, and it's yours to enforce or release, entirely at your discretion." He let that sit. I read the note 3 times before I said anything. I have learned that the second read is where you catch what you miss being moved by the first, and the third read is where you find out if you're actually going to act on what you know. There was a second folder. Smaller. Elliot said David had asked him, months before the accident, to hold a letter, the kind of instruction that sounds routine in a lawyer's office and devastating everywhere else. If anything happens to me, and if there's ever trouble with her family, give this to Marin. Not before. The letter was 2 paragraphs. David's handwriting, unhurried, the way he wrote everything. He explained the note. I already understood it by then, but the second paragraph was the one that found the soft part of me the exclusion from the wedding hadn't reached. I always meant for this to disappear the day Chloe got married, as a gift from both of us, quietly, no announcement, just gone. But only if they've earned it, Marin. If they treat you the way they sometimes treat you when they think no one's counting, don't you dare forgive it for them. Some debts are supposed to outlive kindness that was never returned. I sat with that letter a long time in Elliot's office. Then I folded it once, carefully, the way you fold something you intend to keep for the rest of your life, and I put it in my bag next to the folded seating chart I hadn't been on. For a while, I didn't act. I want to be honest about that, because the version of this story where I stormed home from Elliot's office with a plan isn't true. I read everything 3 more times over the following 2 weeks. I let the number sit in my chest like a stone I was getting used to the weight of. Calm is not the same thing as weak. My family had spent my whole life confusing the two, and I understood, sitting with that folder, that I was under no obligation to keep correcting them quietly. It didn't take long for the family to start circling something they didn't yet know they'd lost. Chloe called first, breezy, asking whether I could still help out with the tent deposit, since apparently the venue required a larger down payment than expected. My mother mentioned, unprompted, that they were thinking of refinancing the house, just to cover a few wedding things, said with the particular ease of someone who has never once had a bank say no to her. My Aunt Carol, at a family dinner I wasn't invited to but heard about within hours, reportedly told Chloe not to worry about costs. It's family money, one way or another, it always works out. They were making plans around assets they no longer fully controlled, and they didn't know it yet. That's the part that still catches in my throat a little, even now, in the retelling. They had excluded me from the wedding 3 weeks before discovering they needed my signature to properly finance it. The confrontation, when it came, wasn't dramatic. It came in the form of my mother showing up at my door on a Sunday, holding a tin of banana bread like an apology she hadn't decided to make yet. The bank's asking about some old paperwork on the house, she said, standing in my doorway, not quite meeting my eyes. Something with David's name on it. Do you know anything about that? I looked at her for a long moment. I thought about the smirk. I thought about, we all agreed. I thought about how easily she'd said, given how you've been since David, as if my grief were an inconvenience she'd had to schedule around. What did the bank say exactly? I asked. One quiet question. I already knew the answer. I wanted to hear how she'd shape it. She didn't have a real answer. She said something about some kind of lien, and probably a mistake, knowing David. He was always so thorough about paperwork, delivered with a laugh that wanted me to laugh along with her at my dead husband's diligence. I didn't laugh. I told her I'd look into it. Then I closed the door, gently, and called Elliot. Send the letters, I said. Mid-story CTA. If you've ever watched people who couldn't spare you one afternoon suddenly discover an entire family's worth of urgency the moment money was involved, you already know exactly where the story is headed. Stick with me, because the confrontation is coming, and I promise you, it is worth the wait. The gathering was billed as a wedding planning dinner. I understood, the moment I received the invitation extended, notably, for the first time in 3 weeks, that it was actually an intervention, and that I was the one being managed. I said yes. I brought a folder. The dinner was at my parents' house, the maple tree outside doing its familiar slow wave in the window behind my mother's chair. Chloe was there, her fiancé, my Aunt Carol, my father quiet at the head of the table the way he always is when my mother has decided how an evening will go. I arrived knowing more than every person in that room combined, and I sat down and ate my salad and let them believe I still didn't. My mother made the opening move. She'd clearly rehearsed it, a small speech about family, about how things had been said in the heat of the moment, about how of course I was welcome to be part of Chloe's day in whatever way felt right for me now. It was an apology shaped like a verdict, generous only in its own estimation. She finished by saying warmly that they hoped I'd help make the day everything Chloe deserved. They gave me the floor because they thought I was there to accept the terms. I appreciate you saying that, I said. My voice didn't change. I have found, in courtrooms and kitchens both, that a level voice does more damage than a raised one ever could. I actually did want to talk about the wedding. Specifically about how it's being paid for. I opened the folder. I laid the promissory note on the table first, turned so my mother could read the amount without me having to say it out loud. This is a note David recorded 6 years ago, when you were 41 days from losing this house. $180,000 secured against the property. It's still active. The balance, with interest, is $161,400 as of the 1st of this month. My mother's face did something I'd never seen it do, the smirk's exact opposite, a kind of physical retreat, like watching someone realize the floor they're standing on is load-bearing after all. That was a gift, she said. David told us. David told you he'd help, I said. He also told me, in writing, exactly what this was and exactly what it wasn't. I set the second document beside the first, the amortization schedule, 25 years of $25 payments logged in David's own careful columns. You've been servicing a lien for 6 years and calling it generosity. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a choice you made not to ask what you were signing. My Aunt Carol said something loud about how this isn't what David would have wanted, and I let that sit in the air a moment before I answered it, because escalation deserves a pause, not a match. You're right that it isn't, I said quietly. David wanted it forgiven. He wrote that down too. I set the letter on the table last, face up, and read one line aloud, the only line I let leave the room that night. Some debts are supposed to outlive kindness that was never returned. Nobody spoke. My mother's face moved through something soft, then something wounded, then something loud. She said my name the way you say a word you're hoping will undo something, and then, finally, quiet. The particular silence of someone doing arithmetic they'd never expected to have to do out loud. My father hadn't said a word the whole dinner. He looked at the note, then at me, and something in his face didn't fight it. He nodded once, almost to himself, and looked down at his hands. It didn't fix anything. It didn't need to. I noticed it, and I let it be exactly what it was, a man seeing something clearly for the first time, too late to change what had already been decided without him. I placed the seating chart on top of the pile last. The one with my name missing. I didn't say anything about it. I didn't have to. Some documents indict themselves. I stood up before anyone found a way to answer. I hope the wedding is everything Chloe deserves, I said, and let the silence after it do what a raised voice never could. Then I picked up my folder and left them at the table with everything they needed to understand exactly what they'd traded a seat at a wedding for. The note was never enforced in the way my family had clearly braced for. I didn't call it due. I didn't take the house. I want to be honest about that, because this was never a story about taking something from people who had less than me to begin with. What I did was simpler and final in its own quiet way. I had Elliot draw up a formal release, not a gift wrapped in silence the way David originally intended, but a clean, documented forgiveness of the full balance, $161,400. Addressed not to my parents, but to Chloe, as a wedding gift in David's name, with one condition attached in writing, that it be understood, permanently, as coming from David and from no one else who'd sat at that table. My mother signed it without a word. I think, by then, she understood that silence was the only currency she had left that I still valued. I wasn't at the wedding. That part didn't change, and I never asked it to. Some rooms you don't fight your way back into. You just stop needing their permission to be whole. My Aunt Carol didn't speak to me for the better part of a year, which I have found, in the time since, to be one of the more restful outcomes of the entire affair. Chloe wrote me a letter of her own, eventually. Not an apology exactly, more an acknowledgement. The kind young people write when they're starting to understand that the family that raised them and the family that's fair to them aren't always the same institution. I keep it in the same drawer as David's. My father calls me now sometimes, just to talk. Not to ask for anything. It's a small thing. It's the thing I'd wanted for longer than I'd admitted to myself. The letter, David's letter, doesn't live in a drawer anymore. I had it framed, the single page, his handwriting intact, and it hangs in my office above the shelf where I keep the files of clients who are, in one form or another, quietly discovering the same thing I did. That the paperwork was never the cold part of the story. The paperwork was the only part of the story that was ever telling the truth. With the money that would have gone toward my seat at a wedding I wasn't invited to, I did something David would have liked far more. I set up a small scholarship fund at the engineering school he graduated from, in his name, for students who needed exactly the kind of quiet, unglamorous help he'd once given without asking anyone to notice. It isn't revenge. It never needed to be. It's simply the debt I actually owed, not to my family, but to him finally, properly paid. I don't think of what happened as revenge, even now, and I'd ask you not to either. Revenge implies I took something that wasn't mine. What I did was stop making payments on a debt I never agreed to carry in the first place, the quiet, permanent expectation that I would keep giving, keep absorbing, keep showing up, long after the people receiving it had stopped bothering to notice. Boundaries, it turns out, don't require an audience's approval to be real. They only require you to write them down and mean them. If this reminded you that quiet people keep the receipts and that boundaries are allowed even with blood, take that as your sign today. Update what needs updating. Tell someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.